you so much. And and now I want to reach out to the attendees to let you know that we are going to begin now webinar number 4. There's, I think, a handful of you that stayed all the way through, and others have come and go. We are happy to have those of you who are able to join us for this talk by Dr. Nicholas Schreck. He is the School of Law Associate Dean of Experiential Education. He's also director of the Environmental Law Clinic of the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. And last but not least, he is also co-chair of the Great Lakes Pioneers Detroit Conference. And this year, we are not having our in-person conference because of all the restrictions due to coronavirus. But we do hopefully plan to have our conference next year. It all remains to be seen, but we are hopeful. And if conditions allow, we plan to have our conference next year. Otherwise, in the meantime, we're getting experience with the Zoom. And we are so glad that under these circumstances, we can still be with you online safely on Zoom, where we can hear Dr. Schreck's ideas and talks and expertise he is about to share with us on the topic of environmental justice, climate change, and public engagement. As he speaks, if you have any questions, there is a button near the bottom of your screen. If you start moving your cursor around, you may see a series of controls, and one says Q&A. So whenever he says something and you wish you knew more about it, open up that Q&A and write a question, and we'll be happy to entertain your question during the Q&A session at the end of his talk. So please, Dr. Schreck, we welcome you and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Professor Presby. And if I could ask Gail, is it possible for me to be able to share my screen if maybe I'm exposed?
Okay, hold on. I will do it.
And I can start in the meantime, but I have a couple short video clips that I'd like to show a little bit later.
So you should be able to do it all.
Oh yeah, cool. Okay, great. Oh wait, let's see. Now I've done in. How do I get out of this? Okay. All right. Now I'll be able to do that now. All right. Sorry about that. I'm getting my technical sea legs here. Well, thank you all for being here, and I appreciate that it's challenging sometimes to stick around on these video calls and to listen to all this content. But I think we've had a really interesting and engaging series of presentations today. And I'd like to just take a little bit of time here this afternoon and talk about some issues that are really at the forefront of political debates. Last night in the presidential debate, there was a question about climate change and a question about environmental justice, which we'll talk about more today. And I don't necessarily agree with all the answers that I heard last night, or some things that were left unsaid. And so we'll dig into that a little bit. But these are issues of critical importance as we seek to address and attempt to remedy some very long-standing, horrible issues that this country has failed to address. This goes back many hundreds of years to the historic racism in this country and ongoing racism in this country, and how environmental pollution, how where people are able to live or forced to live based on laws and policies, the types of opportunities, educational, healthcare, career opportunities that are available to different people in this country. This has been a long systemic problem here where we really need to address and deconstruct racist ideas and racist structures within our society. And environmental law and policy has a lot to say about that. And I think an important part to play in addressing these historic and current ongoing systemic issues with racism, racial injustice, and this idea of working towards environmental justice, which we will get into today. Before, and yes, welcome St. Paul CCS students, great to see you. And just again, so happy to be with you all here today. I'd like to start with something called a land acknowledgement. And this is something that I do at the beginning of my classes each semester at the university. And this will only take a couple minutes, but I think it helps to center us and for us to think about the history of the land, the area where we all are here in Southeast Michigan, and the historical significance of this place. So if you'll please bear with me, I'm just going to read this short land acknowledgement. And this land acknowledgement was actually created to be used by universities in the Detroit area by David Pitwanakwat. And David was actually a student at Detroit Mercy Law School. He studied in our dual degree program, which is a law school program where students in 3 years, they can, once they've completed their course of study after 3 years, they can sit for the bar exam, which means take a test that would allow them to practice law either in the United States or in Canada. And so this was a land acknowledgement that was drafted by David. This university sits on the traditional lands and territory of the Anishinaabe people, also known as the Three Fires of the Confederacy, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. Since the beginning of time, it has served as an important and sacred place for these tribes and many other tribes throughout this region. Today and every day, we acknowledge the peoples native to this land and the land itself. It's this university's responsibility as an academic institution to respectfully discuss and educate about the traditional people of this land and the hardships they've faced and continue to face. Our intent is always to educate and enlighten, never to accuse or blame. So thank you, and I think it is important to think about the sense of place and to how we all got here and what our role and responsibility is in this discussion. And I also just wanted to start by thanking Great Lakes Bioneers. Bioneers is just a wonderful organization, and we're so happy and fortunate to be able to partner with Great Lakes Bioneers through this conference and through future conferences at University of Detroit Mercy. And again, just a wonderful organization. I'd urge you to check out their website and learn more if you're new to Bioneers. Just a wonderful network of people that are working hard and diligently to make the environment healthy and to make the world a better place for all of us. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here today. When we talk about environmental justice and we talk about environmental racism, I need to acknowledge right out of the gate here that I am not the perfect messenger. I'm a white male. I grew up in a relatively affluent household. I've had many opportunities in my life. And so for me to talk about environmental justice and environmental racism, it feels a little bit strange because I am not the person that has been on the receiving end of many of these injustices. I will say that I have learned from wonderful teachers, wonderful people who do have the lived experience and the knowledge gained from living in and being from environmental justice communities. And I always try and listen as much as I can and talk a lot less so that I can learn from their experiences and then hopefully use the privileges and the positions that I have to try and carry their voices and their messages forward. And so I would just mention two people that are real mentors to me, Rhonda Anderson and Teresa Landrum, who have both been working on environmental justice issues for a very long time in the city of Detroit and have taught me so much about the struggles of their community and the many victories and celebrations that they've had as a result of their hard work and their focus on trying, again, to make their neighborhoods cleaner and safer and sustainable places for themselves and their families and their communities. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that at the outset that, I'm here to talk about some of the laws and the policies and the ways for those of us to be involved working for positive and proactive change. But, I need to acknowledge that I'm not from these communities and I am just someone who's here in solidarity with them and trying to work side by side with them to address these injustices. Okay, so when we talk about environmental justice, this is a movement that really came out after the major environmental movement, which really started in this country on the heels of the civil rights movement. So mid to late 1960s and then early 70s. In 1970, we had the first Earth Day. This was where there was, massive street protests, people out demanding change from our elected officials at the state level and at the federal level in Washington, D.C., demanding that they address very harmful, terrible environmental consequences that were being visited upon our entire country. Water pollution. There had been Lake Erie had been declared a dead lake because there was so much pollution. The oxygen levels in the lake had dropped so precipitously that it was very difficult for fish to survive. There wasn't enough oxygen in the water for fish to survive. And we had massive fish kills in Lake Erie. You may have heard, perhaps in a history class, about some contamination near Lake Erie on a river called the Cuyahoga River, which flows near Cleveland into Lake Erie. That river caught fire multiple times, and it was so polluted that the fire department had to just let the fires burn out because there were so many chemicals and other pollutants in the water that they couldn't suppress it with their equipment. They just had to let it burn out. We had similar incidents here in Detroit. The Rouge River actually caught on fire again because it was so polluted. And so those are just a couple examples. We had people that died just from breathing in air from chemical releases. There was a major release in Pennsylvania where over 50 people died. And so there was just this acknowledgement that we had to do better. We had to have some system of national laws and regulations to address this persistent environmental pollution that was making people sick, that was costing lives, and that was doing so in an unequitable and unjust way. So in 1970, we had the first Earth Day. There was this massive movement demanding change. Finally, the United States Congress listened and forced President Nixon at the time to go along with some movements to pass some major environmental legislation. Things you may have heard about, like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, a less known law, but something that's very important, the National Environmental Policy Act. That law sets out the procedures by which our government makes environmental decisions and how they decide whether or not to approve different types of activity that is likely to pollute or harm the environment. And that's through something that we call environmental assessments, you may have heard about, but this is the process that our government uses to look at a proposed new coal-fired electric power plant or an expansion of a highway or adding a big oil pipeline. Those kinds of major infrastructure projects that will have an environmental impact, they require an environmental assessment to look at what those harms might be and to hopefully come up with less polluting alternatives to try and make our government stop and think about what the consequences are of the permits that they issue and try and only issue these permits in a way that is the least polluting. So all of those laws were passed. We started to see almost immediately some positive reductions in air pollution and in water pollution in the early 1970s. But there became a realization that there was a big missing piece to our environmental laws, and that was a failure to recognize the past injustices, a failure to recognize the harm that decades, over a century of decisions that had been made that had adversely affected people in this country, primarily racial minorities, and race was always a bigger determinant of whether you were likely to experience more pollution than class, meaning that wealthy African Americans, wealthy Latinos were still more likely to live next to a hazardous waste disposal facility or next to a landfill. They were more likely to live in those circumstances than their white counterparts. And the only variable that was different when we've looked at this and studied the numbers is race. And so there was a failure in our environmental laws to address this issue and to look at remedying that situation. I often hear from people, they'll say, and some of you students may live in Southwest Detroit, some of you may be much more familiar with these issues than I am, from the steel mills and the coal plants and the interstate highways and the truck traffic and the amount of pollution that's in the air. There was a failure to address that issue, and oftentimes people will say, well, why don't people just move? Why don't they move from these neighborhoods that are next to the oil refinery or next to the steel mill? And those answers are very complicated because historically, some of those neighborhoods were the only places that African Americans could buy a home in Michigan because of a racist practice called redlining, where many communities were closed off to African American families. So if they wanted to buy a home and live there, build some equity, build some wealth, support their family. They were very limited in the neighborhoods where they could choose to purchase homes because of these racist policies in real estate transactions. And then you would see things like expansions of the oil refinery closer and closer into neighborhoods, and where the oil refinery would buy out some homes, but then not others. So people who used to live quite a ways away from a polluting industry were now right across the street and living in what we call fence line communities. You know, being next to the fence where you look through it and you see the oil refinery, you see the steel mill, and you can feel and you can taste and you can smell that pollution. And so our environmental laws did not recognize this historic racial injustice and did nothing to try and remedy those past injustices. Instead, it was always forward-looking, like, okay, when we have new facilities, we'll make sure that they install better technology to control pollution. But we didn't do anything to rectify these past harms. So the environmental justice movement, largely a people of color and an indigenous peoples movement, to demand recognition of past environmental racism and to demand that our government seek to remedy and rectify these injustices in the future. And so environmental justice is a movement that was really gaining steam in the 1980s. Some of the early issues they worked on dealt with waste disposal, hazardous waste disposal. If you were an African American in this country, and this is still true today, you are much more likely to live next to a hazardous waste disposal facility or generating facility. And that again gets back to just a lot of the racist policies that we've had about deciding where to locate these facilities. And so in the 1980s, there was a report that came out. Actually, the United Church of Christ had commissioned this report looking at hazardous waste disposal facilities and the people that lived near them. And they found these very, very disparate or discrepancies based on race about who lived next to these facilities. That research and that study was given to the Congressional Black Caucus, which is the congressional members in the United States Congress who are African American, and they started demanding that our federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency, that they actually focus on environmental justice and make this an issue. It took a lot of work, a lot of hard effort and discussions until eventually under President Bill Clinton in the early 1990s, he issued an executive order, which this is an order that's signed by the president and it is binding on federal agencies, that says that federal agencies must consider environmental justice impacts in their permitting decisions when they make decisions about where to locate major polluting facilities. And they also have to consider environmental justice from a historic perspective and try and work to alleviate some of those historic injustices and inequities. But an executive order it's good in that it's binding on federal government, but it's not binding on other private businesses, private industries, and it doesn't give lawyers like me, it doesn't give us what's called a cause of action or the ability to file a lawsuit to try and address environmental justice harms. So it was a good step forward, but we still have a long ways to go. And we do not have any legislation that has been passed through our federal government that deals with environmental justice. We're left usually with trying to make civil rights type claims, arguing that certain governmental practices are discriminatory in terms of housing or in terms of public accommodation, like where people can eat in restaurants or what type, if they're barred from recreating in parks or something like that. And so we really don't have a system of laws in place designed to address environmental justice. And that continues to be a problem. So we have to use these different legal tools, things like civil rights litigation, or perhaps there's something called nuisance, which is if someone is doing something across the street which impacts you as a citizen or a resident across the street, like dust or air pollution that's harming you, you might be able to sue that person under something called a nuisance. But those are very, very limited circumstances where that kind of lawsuit or litigation can be effective. And so really what we need is some national policy, a national piece of legislation to deal with environmental justice and try and work towards rectifying historic racism. Okay, so there's a great question there in the chat about how do we get to the point where we regulate cumulative pollutants and not just pollutants from a single source? Really good question. And what that question gets at is that the way that we do permitting under, and if we stick with just air pollution for a minute, because it'll be easier to explain, when we do permitting under the Clean Air Act, which is our federal legislation that regulates the amount of pollution that comes out of a smokestack at a factory, that law looks at each facility individually and then determines whether the pollution that they emit is likely to violate a national air quality standard. They're called National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And there's some other air toxics laws that we have that deal with things like mercury and other harmful pollutants. But the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, they really look facility by facility. And there hasn't been legislation that requires a study of all of the different sources of pollution and how they would impact an individual person, say living in Southwest Detroit, that is getting exposed to pollutants from multiple sources, from the oil refinery, from the steel mill, from the wastewater treatment plant. So that's a real gap. It's a real problem. And it's something that, you know, we as lawyers have tried to get creative. And when I talk about public engagement, which is part of the description for today's topic, this is a very related question. We as lawyers, but also we as the public, when we're given an opportunity to comment on a permit proposal, so if there's a facility that is seeking to expand their operations, like Marathon Oil has done in Detroit many times, they need to get a permit, a Clean Air Act permit, to be able to expand. We as the public have the ability to review their draft permit and to make comments either at a public meeting or through email or through written comments. We can send in letters. And demanding cumulative impact analysis is something that we've been doing for a while now in comments for these air pollution permits. So far, it hasn't really been successful. And the answer that we've received often from state and federal government is that, well, it's very expensive. It's a very difficult thing to do. Well, my response would be is that we have the money. We just haven't made the priority collectively as a society to invest in this type of analysis. And so right now, that cumulative impacts analysis, it is not required by law. It's something that we need to change the law. We need to make it something that is required for permitting review. And we also need wide-scale health studies. We really need to talk with people, get consent to where we could have a study done where people could have health assessments. We could look at kind of a baseline level of, you know, what type of pollutants and contaminants do people have in their blood, or what types of pollution are they experiencing already. And then we would know when there's additional sources of pollution that come in, you know, where that, we can see where their baseline is and then see if people continue to have higher levels of pollutants in their bodies. And then you could perhaps look at some litigation against facilities for that kind of thing. Let me just check this next question here. Seems like the mindset for a fix is part of the problem. Can only solve part of the problem, like electric vehicles only solving a small part of air pollution. But yes, you know, building electric vehicles certainly does create some pollution as well. And yeah, I mean, I think, should we think more like Indigenous people about our relationships with everything and everyone? And do I agree with that? I would say yes, I largely agree with that description. A big problem that we have is we get, I don't know if you've heard the term siloed, we kind of get like tunnel vision and we think about issues only in an isolated way. And I tell my law students all the time that, you know, my smartphone, it has minerals and metals in it that were probably mined in Central America or in Africa. And it might have been mined in places where they didn't have good environmental laws in place or good environmental protections. And perhaps people were exploited in those communities where those resources were extracted from. And, you know, I don't necessarily know where everything came from that goes into my smartphone, but I need to be a conscious consumer and I need to think about what are the impacts of my lifestyle and the choices that I make. What are those impacts having on other people? And I think, you know, thinking holistically, thinking, you know, more like a lot of our Indigenous brothers and sisters that would think more about, you know, the 7-generation model, like what I do today, how will that impact 7 generations on down the line? I think that's really the approach that we need to take. And just to maybe take a step back for a second here, and I've talked about this a little bit already, but think about how we regulate pollution. And this could be true if we're talking about climate change, so greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide. you know, the way that we regulate pollution under our environmental laws, we don't say that it is illegal to pollute. What we say is that you can pollute so long as you have a permit. Basically, we give licenses for pollution. And I think there's a reason for that, and that is that when these laws were passed in the early 1970s, we didn't want to collapse the economy. There's an understanding that, like your example of building electric cars, yes, that solves one problem of reducing air pollution, but you still have the issue of the battery that the car is made of. You know, where are the materials for that lithium-ion battery mined from? How do we dispose of different components of that vehicle once it's past its useful lifespan? You still have the issue of the rubber and the tires on the roads. You have the issue of brake pad dust, which has pollutants in it when you're hitting the brakes on the road. Some of that little dust sloughs off and gets into the air and into the water. So there's different impacts we can think about for everything that we do, all the conduct that we have. And the way that our system of laws is designed is to look at pollution from these different individual sources rather than thinking collectively and holistically. And I really think that's a failure that we've had to this point in environmental law, and we need to work to address that over time. So now one thing I'd like to do is I'm going to show a short video that talks a little bit about what I mean by environmental racism, and what it talks about. The video also covers some issues you may have heard about, like the Flint water crisis and some air pollution that we have here in Michigan. So give me one moment here and I'll get this going.
When we think of racial injustice, we think police brutality or the criminal justice system. But what about our air and water? Environmental racism. It's about policies and practices that discriminate against communities of color by making them live near landfills, sewage plants, and other polluting facilities. And while poverty has a lot to do with it, the leading environmental justice expert told me this.
Racism trumps class. Even middle-income African Americans are more likely to live in more polluted neighborhoods.
In fact, one study found that Black Americans making $50,000 to $60,000 a year are more likely to live in polluted neighborhoods than white Americans who make just $10,000 a year. Flint, Michigan is a textbook case of environmental racism. It's where 100,000 residents have been poisoned with toxic water contaminated by high levels of lead. Why? Because the state was trying to save a buck. Flint is around 57% Black, with 40% of its population living in poverty. Residents protested the dirty water for over a year, but were ignored. And that's how environmental racism plays out. Minority communities have much less political clout, so regulators can and often do ignore them. And not far from Flint is Detroit, where 83% of the population is Black. It's home to the most polluted zip code in Michigan.
Zip code is the most powerful predictor of health. And all communities and all the zip codes are not created equal.
Southwest Detroit is surrounded by a lot of industry like salt mining, steel production, tar sands oil refining, and coal burning. And that's meant that 1.6 million pounds of chemicals enter that community yearly. Not coincidentally, Wayne County, where Detroit is, has the highest number of children's asthma cases in the state. But look, environmental racism isn't just a Michigan story. It's an American story. Take, for example, Louisiana's Cancer Alley, an 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River. It's known for its over 200 petrochemical plants and a high rate of cancer, mainly among Black residents. So, is there anyone protecting folks from environmental racism? Well, there's supposed to be. The Environmental Protection Agency has a special department called the Office of Civil Rights. But in its 22-year history, the office has never formally found a single case of discrimination. In fact, more than 90% of communities that make complaints find them rejected or dismissed. On top of that, The Guardian newspaper recently revealed that U.S. authorities across the country are deliberately distorting water tests in cities like Detroit and Philadelphia to minimize the reported amount of lead in the water. Environmental racism, while not always the most visible form, is also widespread. So, when is enough enough?
Okay, so I think that video does a good job of quickly discussing some of these key issues when we talk about environmental racism and the attempt of environmental justice to try and address those issues. But as was said there in the video, I mean, one thing that we have to keep in mind is that, like the Office of Civil Rights and the Environmental Protection Agency, they do not have a good track record of bringing enforcement actions against activities that are certainly seem to be discriminatory. And it's also a very high legal bar to meet to show improved discriminatory intent, which is often what's required in our laws. And so we have a long ways to go. And I think just to talk briefly about the Flint situation, I mean, this is really, the water crisis in Flint is a classic example of environmental justice, environmental injustice. You know, just quickly what happened there was that you had Flint and the surrounding communities that at the time were under emergency management, meaning that the governments had been stripped of their ability to govern themselves. There was an appointed official that was in charge making decisions, an official appointed by the governor at the time. And that person was making decisions about where the water supply for the people of Flint was going to come from. And they were working on, Flint and the surrounding county, Genesee County, were working on a proposal to put their own pipeline into Lake Huron and withdraw drinking water from Lake Huron and then provide that to the residents of Flint instead of buying it as part of the city of Detroit's municipal water system, which is this really big water distribution system that reaches all the way up there to Flint. And so while they were planning to work on this new pipeline, they decided to switch their water supply from the city of Detroit to water from the Flint River and to treat that water from the Flint River in a treatment plant there in the city of Flint that was not designed to be an everyday water treatment plant. It was there as sort of an emergency backup redundancy facility. But they made that switch, and again, this was a decision that was primarily made by an appointed emergency manager, not the people of Flint and their government. And the water from the Flint River was more corrosive, meaning that it was leaching into the pipes. Many of the pipes that distribute water within the city of Flint are made of lead, and the water treatment plant there in Flint failed to add some chemicals which could actually reduce the amount of corrosion of that lead. The lead got into the water, and then people were drinking that water. People were bathing with that water, and we had very, very high levels of lead in people's blood that was observed as a result of this crisis. There's a lot of other stuff that went on there, including sampling, dishonesty, and outright strategies to try and make the crisis, to have the perception of the crisis be that it wasn't as bad as it was made out to be. But really all of that stuff was just a whole load of bull. And you had an attempt to save some money by not adding this corrosion control, save some money by switching to a different water supply. And the consequences were people were exposed to very high levels of lead. And that can be very, very harmful to children. Lead is a powerful neurotoxin, and it can cause all sorts of negative health outcomes, including things like hyperactivity, attention deficit type of issues, antisocial type behavior in adults. And so these are things that will put further stress on the community of Flint that was already struggling through disinvestment and a lot of the same sort of historic racism that we've experienced in the city of Detroit. So the Flint water crisis is a classic example of how even when now we've identified something that was a clear environmental injustice, the consequences of those decisions have really not been felt by the people responsible. We have not had people convicted of crimes related to the Flint water crisis. There's been lengthy delays in prosecution. Even through today, we're still waiting to see whether or not additional people will be charged in the Flint water crisis and held responsible for these decisions that were made that harmed people. So I guess the point is that it continues to be a real challenge, but I do want to not be all doom and gloom. I think we do need to talk about some hopeful things that we can do and some steps that we can take as a public to be more engaged and to really force our government to do their job, to force our government to protect people, and to force our agencies that are charged with promoting a healthy environment and promoting public health to make sure they're doing their job, hold them accountable. And so I want to talk just for a couple minutes about ways for us to be involved through public engagement, to try and work and address issues like climate change, and to continue to work towards rectifying these historic environmental injustices and to work towards a more just and equitable and healthier future. There are some tools within our existing laws that provide us as the public the ability to be involved and to be active and to push for change and to push for positive change. One way that we can do that is by access to information. So we can only make suggestions to change a permitting decision or to change where one of these polluting facilities is located, or to ask for a cumulative impacts assessment like one of the questions in the chat. And again, cumulative impacts, that's looking at all the different types of exposures that are coming from multiple sources, not just from one particular facility. We can ask for that only if we have good information where we can make good, smart requests of our government to do the job. And also we need that good information to be able to do things like file lawsuits to try and hold people accountable. And one way that we get that information is through a very, very important law that you should all know about. And this isn't an environmental law, but it's something that we use all the time in the practice of environmental law. And that is something called the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. And the Freedom of Information Act is so important because that is how we as the public can get access to the records, the documents that our government has that they rely on to make decisions. So in the state of Michigan, the agency that does environmental permitting is called, it's called EGLE, but it's the Environment, Great Lakes and Energy Department. Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE, they're the ones that do all of the permitting. And so you or I or any citizen can send a request to EGLE for documents that they have in their control, and we can then review them. We can either go in person and review them. Of course, today with COVID, we want to wear a mask and keep our distance if we're doing that in person, but they can also scan documents and send them to us, or photocopy documents and mail them to us. And we would have to pay a fee to have those documents scanned and mailed. But that's really important because if I hear about a factory going in down the street, I will not know just by a news report or something like that. I may not know what type of pollution they're going to emit or what their plans are ultimately for that facility. The way that we get that information is through doing these Freedom of Information Act requests. So that's a really, really important law. It's a great way to hold our government accountable because we can see what evidence that they're using, they're relying on to make decisions. And sometimes the evidence they rely on is not very good. And sometimes through FOIA requests, we find out actually there's some illegal behavior going on. Or maybe there was a bribe or some sort of a sweetheart deal given to a particular developer. Those are the kinds of things we can uncover through Freedom of Information Act requests. Now, working in partnership with that law is a law that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, and that's something called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And the National Environmental Policy Act isn't widely known, but this is a very important law because it sets out the procedures for the way our government makes environmental decisions. And part of those procedures include the ability for the public to have notice and the ability to comment on federal environmental decisions. So notice means that when there is a facility that's proposed to be built or expanded or major changes, modifications made to a facility, the public has to be notified of that proposed change. And we get the ability to comment on a draft permit before that permit is finalized. And that is where we can ask for things like a cumulative impacts analysis. We can ask for clarification about how a particular type of pollutant will be monitored, how they plan to clean the air or scrub the air before it's released from a smokestack. All those kinds of things we can ask and be part of this public process through the National Environmental Policy Act. For activity that doesn't have any federal connection to it, and this gets into some complicated legal stuff, but there's also laws here in the state of Michigan that basically provide for the same things. So we can have these same type of public meetings, we can have the same type of comment process for permits that are only dealing with state law here in Michigan. And I don't have time to get into and explain the differences between federal permits and state permits, but for our purposes today, you should just know that either way, there's the ability for us as the public to be engaged in the process, to demand certain things be looked at, certain things be analyzed as part of these permits. Now, that doesn't always mean that through this process we get what we want, or that we actually stop a permit from being finalized and released and allowing polluting activity to continue or to begin. But what we can do through this public comment process is we can build a record. We can create a body of evidence that then can be used to perhaps challenge a polluting facility down the road. And when I say challenge, I mean file a lawsuit, sue them if they are receiving a permit that is not lawful, or if they're engaging in activities that are violating their permit. We can hold them accountable. And so the permitting process, it involves this ability for us to be engaged in a public comment, to submit comments, to make requests of our agencies before permits are issued. And that's a really, really good public engagement strategy if there's something for us to use. Related to that, related to this permitting process, there's also the ability of us as a public to be involved legislatively, and we want to let elected officials know if we're concerned about a particular facility and the pollution that they're emitting. We want to talk to our local government. We want to talk to our mayors, to our city council members. We want to contact our members of Congress, contact our senators, contact the president, let them know that we're concerned about particular issues, because they do listen, especially locally. If there's a lot of comments and complaints that come in about a facility to a city council, they often will investigate and will at least respond in some way, because they want to respond to voters, right? Like if people, it's sort of like the old squeaky wheel gets the grease. If we make a lot of noise and we raise a lot of concerns, often that's the way that these types of issues can be addressed. Okay, I see a question here about, once an environmental law is passed, what tools or regulations are there for enforcing those laws? Really, really good question. And I'll get to the FOIA question in just a second. So once laws are passed, how do we see that they're enforced? One really brilliant thing that was included in some of our environmental laws in the early 1970s is something called citizen suits, citizen suit provisions. In citizen suits, it's a lawsuit. It's a type of litigation that we as the public can pursue to make sure that violations of permits, emissions that exceed the permitted amount, people that are violating conditions, terms of their permits, we can enforce that through a citizen suit. And the way that this works is that, let's take the Clean Air Act, for example, so air pollution, the smoke coming out of a smokestack at a factory. If that facility is violating their permit and the government does not enforce the violation, so the Eagle, Environment, Great Lakes and Energy Department in Michigan, or the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, if they don't bring their own lawsuit or their own enforcement action, then we can file a citizen suit. And the way that that's done is there's a process where you have to give a notice letter, they call it, and that is you have to send a letter to the company, the facility that's engaged in the pollution. You have to copy the state authorities, so Eagle, and the federal authorities, EPA. And you have to say, within 60 days, fix this problem, stop this pollution from happening, hold them accountable, or we are going to file a lawsuit. And that's called a notice of intent to sue letter. And that notice letter the reason why they require that under the law is because that would give the state and federal agencies the time to bring their own enforcement action to effectively do their job, is what that means. And we want government to do that without the citizens or environmental organizations or public health advocates. We shouldn't have to always be spending our time and money litigating, filing these citizen suit lawsuits. We should try and force the government to do the job for us. So there's that 60-day notice letter. If the government does not bring an enforcement action at that time, then we can file a lawsuit. And that is a key way that we can hold our government accountable for enforcing the law. Environmental laws are only as strong as their enforcement mechanisms. You could have a piece of legislation, a law that's passed that is just great, beautiful, looks amazing. But if it's not enforced, if there's no mechanism to fine people that violate the permit or the conditions of the law, not an ability to charge people criminally if they violate the law, then you're not going to have a very, very strong impact from it, because there's a real lack of enforcement. So there's another question about the Freedom of Information Act, and how do you make a FOIA request about a particular facility and what types of things should you ask for? Really good question. So first thing you want to think about is what type of information are you looking for? So let's take an example. I'll just say a steel mill, and I won't name one, but let's say there's a large facility in Detroit or Dearborn that's producing steel, and they release a lot of air pollution. It's regulated, they have a permit, but let's say I see one day some orange smoke coming out of the smokestack, and I think, that's probably not right, something's probably wrong there, and I want to know what happened. Well, so through the state regulator, which again, this is the Environment, Great Lakes and Energy Department, EGLE, they actually have a website dedicated to Freedom of Information Act requests for environmental permitting. So you can go to their website, and through the website, you can actually type in your request. You can say, I'm concerned about, X steel company in Dearborn. On or about October 20th, I saw this orange plume of smoke. I'd like to know what happened. I would like to know if there's any like incident reports, any sort of emergency response that was triggered as a result of this strange smoke. You could ask for those types of things. One thing I will caution is that you want to be as specific as you can be as specific as you can be, because a lot of these big industrial facilities, they have thousands and thousands of pages of reports and data. And so you wouldn't want to ask for too much and then have to comb through hundreds or thousands of pages. And that can also be expensive if you want them to be reproduced. So for a FOIA request, I tell my students it's almost more of an art. You have to think through like, okay, what am I looking for? What types of questions do I need to ask? And a good thing to do is in your FOIA request, you could say, before you start producing any documents under this request and potentially, asking me to pay money to have these documents produced, please call me or please email me. I'd like to talk in a little bit more detail about what I'm looking for. That's something that you can ask. And if you know in particular the date that something happened, or if you know that a facility is planning to do some sort of expansion and you have some specificity about what you're looking for, you could ask for the engineering plans, you could ask for the consultant reports about the design of this facility, any of those kinds of things, you can put those requests in there. FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, is not just for environmental issues. It's a great law to use in general. So like if you have a question about something going on with your public school board, or if you have a question about something that the mayor did, or a letter or something that was sent by the mayor, you can send a FOIA request to the city of Detroit and say, I'm interested in the letter that Mayor Duggan sent to, so-and-so on August 15th or around there. You can get that specific with it, and they should produce the records. Now, if your request is too broad, if you just were to say like, I want all of the records that EGLE has on the Detroit wastewater treatment plant, well, that again could be tens of thousands of pages, and they would likely deny your request by saying that it's too broad, that it's too voluminous. So you do want to narrow in a little bit. So if you're asking about the wastewater treatment plant and you're worried about their water pollution, you might say, I'd like to see the water discharge permit and any violations of that permit in the last 6 months, those kinds of things. And one suggestion I would also make would be putting time limits on it. Like if there's a facility that's been around for a while and they probably have to report pollution data weekly or monthly, you want to put a time limit on it, because otherwise you can get stacks and stacks of documents. And again, to have those reproduced, have them copied or scanned, we do have to pay a fee for that. So, we're almost out of time here, but a little bit more on climate change and public engagement. I think, really what we need, we're at this impasse right now, where we're not getting a response from our federal government that is a real response that's appropriately addressing climate change. At the state level, it's a very similar situation where I think we're getting past the denial phase, the phase of, oh, climate change isn't real, or calling into question whether humans are actually causing it. Although Vice President Pence basically made that argument in his vice presidential debate, which is just ridiculous. I tell my students now all the time, we can disagree about, how aggressive we want to be in responding to climate change and working towards solutions. But I don't have the discussion anymore about whether or not it's a real thing or whether or not humans are causing it. The science on that is very clear. There's no dispute. And so that's the way that I answer it. I say, hey, if you want to talk about solutions or you want to argue, should we tax carbon? Should we come up with some sort of cap and trade system or some other scheme to try and reduce pollution? Let's have that debate. But I do not engage in discussions about whether or not it's actually a problem, because it is. It's occurring. We're living in a warming world. We're dealing with those consequences. And so I think what we have to do is we have to demand, part of elections, when there's candidates that come through and they want to speak to us and ask for our vote, we should get them on record about what they're going to do to work towards a healthier climate. What are they going to support legislation that taxes pollution and then invests in environmental justice communities, those resources that we need to address all of these historic injustices and historic racism and environmental permitting? Those are the kinds of things we need to get people on the record about before they're in office. And then we need to hold them accountable when they are in office, sending them letters, calling them, demanding that they vote and that they support activities that will, limit greenhouse gas emissions, limit pollution, and again, work towards addressing some of these ongoing problems in environmental justice communities that have been overburdened with pollution for generations. So that is another key thing that we can do for public engagement. It's election season right now. If you're old enough to vote, or if you have family members that are old enough to vote, please encourage them to do so. Encourage them to vote for candidates that care about the environment and that are invested in our health and our future. That's a very, very important thing to do. And they can be any political parties, but they need to be people that are realistic and that are serious about addressing these issues, or else we're just going to get a bunch of talk and we're not going to get where we need to be. So that's, I guess, the last thing I would say, just in this season of election time, that, getting people out to vote, encouraging them to vote, that's really one of the best tools we have, is to support candidates that can push these policies forward locally, at the state level, and nationally. And then we have these other tools, like being able to comment on permits, being able to use citizen suits to file lawsuits to enforce those permits, and to make our voices be heard when there's public meetings. And just in the last minute I've got here, so many of these decisions are made at the local level. They're made in these committee meetings at city councils, or something called the zoning board, which zoning boards are these local units of government within your communities that decide what type of a building can be put on a particular lot within a city, what type of activity can take place on a given piece of property. Those are really important decisions, and very few people typically attend those meetings. Now most of them are like this, they're over Zoom. But if you're able to attend those, if you're able to ask questions, if you're able to ask clarifying questions, ask for things to be changed, that is often a really great way to influence decisions, because very few people take advantage of those public meetings to go in and sit at a zoning board. And yeah, it can be a little bit dry and a little bit boring, but it's a great way to have your voice be heard, much more so than casting one important vote for president or something. That is a much more diffuse type of democracy than being able to get into a meeting where there's local decision makers and trying to ask them questions and to demand that they take environmental health seriously. So with that, I'd like to see if there's any more additional questions. You've had great questions so far, and I really do appreciate it. And I also want to thank you for sticking through this. I know it's a lot to listen to and to hear all these presentations, but I do hope that you've learned something and that you maybe thought a little bit about how you can be involved and how you can push for change and use the power that you have as a citizen. That's, again, I go back to 1970. We had horrible pollution. There were serious environmental harms, and it was because people were, in the streets demanding change, getting on the phone, calling their elected officials, demanding change. That's how we passed these environmental laws. And really, since that time, since the 1970s, these environmental laws have been under attack. They've been threatened with repeal or with limiting their effectiveness. And so we have to stay vigilant. And not only do we have to protect our existing environmental laws, we have to work as hard as we can for new legislation and new laws that will address climate change and will, again, get at these historical injustices and historic environmental racism that we really need to address as a country before we can move forward into a sustainable future. So again, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to stick around for a couple minutes if there's more questions.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. That was such a wonderful talk, and you covered so many important issues. Actually, since we're just on our last few minutes, we probably won't have more questions, but I do want to give Sister Gloria Rivera, our outgoing coordinator for GLBD, Great Lakes Bioneers Detroit, to make comments and any closing remarks you'd like to make.
Hope you're moving.
Unmute, please.
Sorry. So thank you very much. Sister Paula has been with me here. Who is the other?
Oh,
There she is.
Hi, Sister Paula. So good to see you.
So it's not been just me, but throughout this 50 years, Paula has been part of this pretty amazing journey with Bioneers. And we're very grateful that the two of you are going to continue with the conference. And we are certainly going to support you in any way we can. But for this specifically, Gail, I want to thank you for all the energy, time, resources, et cetera, that you spent putting together this webinar, because we know anybody who's on this still remaining with us or who has been part of it knows how very challenging it is, not because we're not smart people, but because there's a lot of stuff about technology and things that we are learning, and we are doing that. And the other thing I want to say is, as I was looking through the list of participants, there is one person who I hope she's still in. Her name is Tere Compean. She was my biology teacher in Mexico City, where my love for environmental stuff came. And she's listening to us, or it was part of it, from Mexico. So we had an international conference, and I was just happy to see her name. And maybe there were others that I missed that were on earlier. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Nick, always. And let's just continue to do the best we can to make this a happy, healthy, wholesome earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those closing remarks. Yes, Sister Paula and Sister Gloria, we are happy to try to walk in your footsteps. They're big shoes to fill, but we are looking forward to continuing your work. And I wanted to thank, speaking of all the technology challenges, my colleague who teaches database management at our university, Vijaya Sastry, and her family, Abhiram and Srinivas, who have agreed to stay on our call the whole time in case we have a sudden glitch. And thank goodness our glitches were only at the very beginning, but it's still very nice to know that someone is around and happy to help us if we suddenly had a glitch. And they've also been participating and enjoying the topics and asking questions. So thank you to you all also. And if you take a look, any of you attendees, if you take a look at the chat, you'll see this event was co-sponsored by CLASA, that's the Carney Latin American Solidarity Archive at our university, and which is another hat I wear at the university. And we are going to have a Zoom. If you liked this Zoom, maybe you'll like our next one on November 16th. We are going to take a look at a movement in Central America for community and organic gardening. It's called Vamos a la Milpa. And so please join us on November 16th, 7 to 9 p.m. We also hope, we plan to upload recordings of these Zoom events you've just heard onto our website. And I've given you the link to the GLBD website at our university. It's not there yet, but hopefully in the near future, we'll have these posted here and you can tell your friends to watch them in case they missed them. And the National Bioneers is also going to have a big program in December. And so I have also given you the link to that. So you may want to find out about the larger Bioneers movement at that point. And I think that's all the announcements I wanted to make. You will notice when you finally wave goodbye to us, we'll be asking you just to fill a quick survey about what did you think about this Zoom meeting. This will help us in the future. And so at this point, again, and I notice you are sending us your thank yous. I really appreciate it. We thank you for listening to us and participating with us as we come together as a community to face these environmental challenges and opportunities together. So again, thank you, everybody. See you in the future, online or in person as the circumstances may be. So thank you very much.
Thank
And
you,
now,
Gail. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
you're welcome. And now, goodbye to everyone. I will end the Zoom. Thank you.